Good. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Bernard Prusak, and I'm the director of the McGowan Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility at King's College. King's is a relatively small Catholic liberal arts college in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And if you're a King's student or faculty, you know where that is. Otherwise, you might not know. So Wilkes-Barre is in the northeastern corner of Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us. This is our 2022 Feast of St. Francis event, and our question is whether peace is possible in our times. Let's hope. This event is co-sponsored by the Peace and Justice Center of Northeastern Pennsylvania, or of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, name to be determined. And I'm grateful to my colleague at King's, Margarita Rose, who's a professor of economics, for collaborating with me. She's also very active in the Peace and Justice Center. Margarita will do the introductions.
Thank you, Bernard, and I also extend a welcome to everyone on behalf of the Peace and Justice Center as well. This will be the order in which the panelists will speak, the order in which I introduce them. First, I have my colleague, Beth Admiraal. She's a professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at King's College. She is a co-editor of the journal Occasional Papers in Religion in Eastern Europe, and has published numerous articles on religion and nationalism in the post-Soviet region. My other colleague, Ayesha, is Associate Professor of Political Science at King's. Her research focuses on civil-military relations, conflict, and security issues in South Asia. She is author of two books. One, The Soldier and the State in India, Nuclear Weapons, Counterinsurgency, and the Transformation of Indian Civil-Military Relations, published in 2013. Her second book, Culture, Context, and Capability, Comparing the American and Indian Counterinsurgency Experience, published in 2016. Coming a little further than the King's campus would be Elizabeth Shackelford. She's a senior fellow on U.S. foreign policy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which she joined in January of 2021. Her analysis, writing, and outreach focus on building awareness and understanding of the value of robust diplomatic engagement. Ms. Shackelford was a career diplomat with the U.S. Department of State until December 2017, when she resigned in protest. Her resignation letter was the first to draw widespread attention to the declining state of diplomacy under the Trump administration. She is the author of The Dissent Channel, American Diplomacy in a Dishonest Age, winner of the 2020 Douglas Dillon Book Award. As a Foreign Service officer, Ms. Shackelford served in Somalia, Kenya, South Sudan, Poland, and Washington, D.C. For her work in South Sudan during the outbreak of civil war there in 2013, she received the Barbara Watson Award for Consular Excellence, the State Department's highest honor for consular work. And our fourth panelist is Andrea Bartoli. He is an international conflict resolution expert who has served in key positions for more than 3 decades. He is currently president of the Sant'Egidio Foundation for Peace and Dialogue, a visiting fellow at Columbia University's Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity, and a member of the steering group of the Global Action Against Mass Atrocity Crimes. He served as Dean of the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University from 2013 to 2019, and as the permanent representative of the community of Sant'Egidio to the United Nations and the United States from 1992 to 2018. Dr. Bartoli's research focuses on genocide prevention and international conflict resolution. He has been involved in successful diplomatic activities and peacemaking processes in, among other places, Mozambique, Guatemala, Algeria, Kosovo, Burundi, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Central African Republic, and South Sudan. And I think we'll now hear from Beth Admiraal.
Well, nuts and bolts, just quickly before Beth begins. So we'll have 4 presenters. Beth will speak for around 10 or so minutes, and then the others will follow for about the same. They'll engage one another in some discussion, and then we'll open the floor to questions from everybody else. Please use the chat function, bottom of the Zoom page, to send your questions. You can send questions to all the hosts. And I think you can specify too if you want to send your question to me or to Margarita. But send those questions, if you can specify, either to me or to Margarita, and we'll do our best to make sure that they're entered into the mix. So now, Beth, please. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Bernard. Thank you, Margarita. Thank you to everybody for coming today. So Bernard asked me to speak about conflict, and in particular about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, this is a conflict that it's receiving a lot of attention. It's in the news a lot. And so you all know a lot about this conflict already, which makes my presentation a bit difficult, right? Either you're going to feel really smug and stop paying attention, or you're going to follow really closely and try to get me in the Q&A. So to solve my dilemma, I'm going to speak rather than speaking about the hard power side of the conflict, the tanks, the territory losses and gains, the sanctions, the drones. I'm going to focus on the less noticed aspects of the conflict, the soft power side, which are things like the culture, the values, and the symbols that have been utilized in the struggle. It's undoubtedly the case in this conflict, right, that Russian soft power is a centrally orchestrated tool of Russian foreign policy. It's generated by Russian policy. It's endorsed by the regime, mandated by the regime even, financed by the state budget. And its primary purpose really is to convince Russians, Ukrainians, and even really cultural conservatives globally of the legitimacy of the invasion. So I'm going to speak to that aspect today, just for a few minutes. In the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on two central tools, soft power tools, Russian Orthodoxy and the Russian language. So first, about Russian Orthodoxy. So in the Russian state, the tradition of using the Russian Orthodox Church to project the extent of the Russian Empire goes back centuries. I can't speak, I don't have enough time to speak to all that, but let me point to a moment in 1991 that's pretty critical to the conflict we're seeing today. So a few months before the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the Russian Orthodox Church published a report called Several Countries, One Patriarchate. And of course, as you might imagine from the title, this statement refers to the canonical territory of the Russian Orthodox Church, which doesn't coincide with state boundaries. Right, the church was eager to clarify that if the Soviet Union collapsed, that did not mean necessarily the splintering of the Russian Orthodox Church. Essentially, this created what we might say is like a secular analog to this to the concept of the Russian near abroad. So the Russian Orthodox Church, the largest autocephalous Orthodox church in the world, survived the Soviet collapse without any loss of territory, including without losing authority over the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, with an estimated 150 million adherents across 60 countries. So the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has been caught always, right, and under the jurisdiction of Moscow. And this goes back to 1686. So this is not a new thing. And from that point until a pretty stunning moment in 2019, it was formally bound to Moscow. January of 2019, and in a move that rocked the religious world, it was formally recognized, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, as autocephalous by the Patriarchate of Constantinople, which, for those of you who don't know this lingo, right, is to say it became its own independently governing body. Russian political and religious leaders were infuriated by this recognition of independence. Obviously the position of Ukrainian Orthodoxy within the Moscow Patriarchate really had served a pretty important role in justifying the argument that Ukraine was simply part of a greater Russia. As you can imagine, this announcement presented lots of struggles, everything over control over who was going to control holy sites, the loyalties of small parishes. And at the end of that, there were 7,000 parishes, roughly 7,000 parishes in Ukraine that went over to that were part of the Kiev Patriarchate, and about 13,000 parishes that remained with the Moscow Patriarchate, so still a majority. So the numbers are shifting, by the way. So as you can imagine, a number of those parishes and even some groups that organize parishes now are announcing they're changing allegiances. I think, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia a few years after the split has to be seen as at least partially a reaction against the loss of canonical territory in Ukraine. But despite this sort of diminished presence in Ukraine, the Russian Orthodox Church really continues to be a pretty critical arsenal or weapon in Putin's arsenal. The Russian Orthodox Church supports Putin's invasion of Ukraine at Putin's urging, but also probably his compensation, which apparently is quite generous. The patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Kirill, publicly claims that Russia is not an aggressor. Genocide is being perpetrated against Russian speakers in the Donbass. He's making all these claims that really back up claims that Putin has been making since 2014. This even goes on at a more local level, right? Recently, a local parish priest of the Russian Orthodox Church said, and I quote here, "Russian peacekeepers are conducting a special operation in order to hold Nuremberg trials against the whole of Europe." So in addition, right, Kirill willingly portrays the conflict as a cultural one. He'll talk frequently about the invasion as a war against sin, against threats from the liberal West, against gay parades, against excessive consumption. He gave a homily earlier this year that compared Russia's invasion to a culture war against the West. And this really is kind of an echo of Putin's claim that Ukraine needs to be rescued from the godlessness of the West that's trying to take over Ukraine. Now, in Putin's use of the Russian Orthodox Church to support the invasion, sometimes the line between soft and hard power is blurred a bit. You may have seen the images of Russian priests who have blessed bombs or tanks, prayed over soldiers being deployed. Churches on the front lines have been turned into weapons storehouses. So sometimes we see the soft power element kind of coming right up against the hard power element. To an extent, the extent of the Russian Orthodox Church's support for the war, or the Putin's use of the Russian Orthodox Church to support the war, is so present, right, that recently, after a virtual meeting between the Patriarch and Pope Francis, the Pontiff said, "Brother," and I'm quoting here, "we are not clerics of the state. The Patriarch cannot conform himself into Putin's altar boy." It's probably too late. Kirill and the bulk of the Russian Orthodox Church leadership really has surrendered itself to Putin to be used as sort of celebrity advocates, religious legitimizers, symbol providers to be used in the conflict. Now, a little bit about the place of language politics as a soft power tool in this conflict. In 2014, the Russian state claimed that there was persecution of Russian speakers as a way to justify the annexation of Crimea, and then subsequently have made similar claims about their support for Russian-backed separatists in Ukraine's eastern Donbass region. Right, so the argument is those who speak Russian there are being repressed, persecuted by the Ukrainian authorities. Today, the use of language as a tool of soft power by the Russian state includes many different aspects, restrictions on the Ukrainian language or access to Ukrainian media and online sites, changing school curriculums to align with a pro-Russian narrative, switching street signs to Russian. All of these linguistic endeavors, right, are being implemented in regions of the East that it controls. In July 2021, it was a rather now infamous speech. Putin declared Russians and Ukrainians were, quote, "one people, a single whole, bound by the shared language and culture of the Russian world." Even more than this, Putin has gone as far as to argue that a distinct Ukrainian identity is the product of foreign manipulation. The response to this, right, from not just Ukraine, but also beyond, globally, has been quick. I don't know if you all remember how overnight our own media started saying, instead of Kiev, started saying Kyiv, right? It just instantly a change, right? A sign of support for Ukraine. The latter, of course, is a much more, is a pronunciation closer to the Ukrainian, although no one really bothered to say that before. We had always said Kiev. All of a sudden we say Kyiv. But in addition, some cities, including in Kyiv, have begun removing Russian-related monuments, markers, road signs, and so on. Ukrainian language classes apparently are quite popular now. They fill up quickly, particularly by those living in Ukraine whose mother tongue is actually Russian. A surprising third of all Russians, or of all Ukrainians, will claim to have Russian as their mother tongue. The Ukrainian language really has emerged as a cornerstone of the nation's push towards a strong post-Soviet self-identity, right? As Russia commenced its invasion, really language in some ways became a matter of national survival. So while Putin presses the narrative that Ukrainian people are not ethnically distinct, right? Ukrainians are taking steps to prove the opposite. So what to make of Putin's use of religion and language to support his invasion? Well, the conflict certainly has its hard power side. It would be foolish not to think and care about the threat of NATO for Russia, Russia's fear of losing the buffer between itself and Europe, Putin's belief in empire as a means to restore Russian greatness, and so on. But I think we can't lose sight as we think about this conflict, can't lose sight of the longstanding Russian belief in the organic unity of the Russian Empire and its people, especially its Slavic language and Orthodox core, a form in which the historian Timothy Snyder calls, quote, the politics of eternity, the belief in an unchanging historical essence. It would be foolish to predict how this will end, just as it was foolish to predict its beginning. But while the call for peace is never too early, right now it certainly sounds quite faint. Thank you.
Ayesha, ready to go? Thank you very much, Beth.
Thank you, Bernard, for having me. So thank you to the McGowan Ethics Center, and thank you to the NAPA Peace and Justice Center for having me here on this panel discussion today about whether peace is possible in our time. I was asked to speak about the India-Pakistan conflict, and I'm afraid that my answer to that question is a rather cynical one. And so I will try to speak not more than 7-8 minutes. Hopefully, I'll try and pack as much as I can in those few minutes as possible. And I'd love to have, be part of the discussion more about whether peace is possible in our time. So quickly, to kind of talk about the India-Pakistan conflict, right? I mean, this is one of the most complex, protracted conflicts in the world. Both countries have been at it for plus 70 years. And I use, or at least apply some ideas from the bargaining literature in international politics to kind of think about this conflict. And so essentially, I would argue that these two countries have a commitment problem. And what that means is that there's a lack of trust between the two countries, and I'll explain that in a little bit. And the lack of trust is because the gains or the benefits from fighting are much higher than the benefits from actually arriving at a negotiated settlement. And so continuing to fight is a lot more promising for these two countries. Why do I say that? There are a couple of factors or causal factors that explain that. So the causal factors that explain that or driving this commitment problem are territory, nuclear weapons, and identity issues, including religious nationalism. So I'll deal with each one briefly. The first is sort of the territorial part of it, right? So this is essentially the conflict stems from a territorial conflict over Kashmir. Kashmir is a disputed territory between India and Pakistan. India controls 2/3 of Kashmir. Pakistan controls 1/3 of Kashmir. The origins of the conflict go back to 1947, when Kashmir was sort of a princely state, an independent state. And when the two countries were divided, there was a war. And in the ensuing war, tribesmen from the Pakistani side attacked this independent kingdom, which was actually ruled by a Hindu ruler. And under duress, he signed an Instrument of Accession, which gave India the power to fight back against the Pakistani tribesmen who had invaded. But India wanted him to become part of the Indian state. And so he acceded, and that's called the Instrument of Accession, which was signed at that time. Following which, there were negotiations at the United Nations about holding a plebiscite. Now, unfortunately, that plebiscite never really materialized. A couple of, Indian leaders, Kashmiri leaders were actually imprisoned. Sheikh Abdullah, one of the most, the biggest leaders of Kashmir, who was actually very pro-India. And India, I would say the Indian state manhandled the situation pretty badly. So in 1986, for instance, there was an election that was rigged. And from 1987, after that election, there was a full-blown insurgency against Indian rule in Kashmir. And this was actually aided by the Pakistani state eventually, which sent in militants. And so terrorism is still a very active part of Kashmir. Basically, we call that a proxy war in the subcontinent. And Pakistan has tried to undermine, Indian conventional military superiority in Kashmir by pushing these militant groups in, like the Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Jaish-e-Mohammed. So there's state-sponsored terrorism from Pakistan happening, and that's still prevalent in Kashmir. So that's one angle. Now, quickly to say that the Kashmiri identities are multifaceted. There are majority of Kashmiri Muslims. You have Kashmiri Pandits who are a minority. Now, this minority was also they lost a lot of their homes because they were driven out. So there was sort of an ethnic cleansing in the 90s when the insurgency broke out. And the Pandits, who are the Hindus, they feel alienated today, and they are pitted now against the Kashmiri Muslims. So that's one angle also that is part of the Kashmir issue that stays alive. So there's terrorism, there's failures of the Indian state, and there's identity politics there. Quickly, the second issue that I want to focus on is nuclear weapons. India became a declared nuclear weapon state in 1998. In 1974, it tested its nuclear weapons for the first time, but that was for peaceful energy use. But in 1998, its nuclear weapons tests were for strategic use of nuclear weapons. Pakistan followed suit, and since then, both countries have a nuclear weapons arsenal. India has about 160 weapons. I would say Pakistan would have like 130, 140. They're pretty close. Now, what this does is that you have two adjacent neighbors who are nuclear adversaries. They have nuclear weapons. We have, at least from the Indian side, a fairly strong command and control structure, but that could be undermined any minute if there's a communication problem, if there's uncertainty, or any of those chains of command were to break down. So this is, while there is some sort of credible deterrence in place, this is a serious sort of issue. And for Pakistan and India, India has sort of a conventional superiority in this regard. So what that does for Pakistan is to kind of push or test Indian limits in Kashmir, particularly, and along the line of control. So what we call this in sort of international security languages is the stability-instability paradox. You have nuclear weapons, but in the shadow of nuclear weapons, you have an incentive to fight limited wars, which is you want to kind of push in short crises. You want to attack through limited strikes. You want to see how far your opponent can go just under the shadow of nuclear weapons, but there's a lot of unpredictability there, right? And so that's the second issue, the nuclear weapons issue. The third thing I want to kind of focus on is the change in the domestic politics in India with the rise of Hindu nationalism, majoritarian Hindu nationalism under the Narendra Modi government, right? And this is seen as a serious threat, not just to the identity of the Muslims in India, who are facing very direct attacks and threats to their lives every day, but also to the neighbor, Pakistan, which actually, ironically, was also founded on the principles of religion, right? So that was more, Pakistan was founded as a religious state. India was founded as a secular state, but India is going down the line or the direction of Pakistan today, I would say, which is deeply alarming. And what we notice here in terms of evidence is frequent attacks on minorities, minority Muslims. This, of course, doesn't bode well for Kashmiri Muslims, who are a majority themselves in Kashmir, but see the Modi government as somewhat acrimonious, right, to their positions. The Modi government also revoked Kashmir's autonomous status in 2019, which was a deep blow to their sort of constitutional link to India. And that created even further resentment among the Kashmiri population, Muslim population, against the policies of the Modi government. Very briefly, the Modi government has imprisoned journalists, activists on arbitrary charges. The media, which is supposed to hold the government accountable, is actually parroting a lot of the propaganda by the government. There's been a somewhat of a corrosion of institutions where we see the Supreme Court in India kind of divided over issues like Muslim women wearing the hijab and other such issues. And so basically the secular fabric of India, which is built into the Indian constitution, is under attack and is sort of gradually withering away. So these identity issues, along with the types of weaponry that India possesses, having nuclear weapons, both countries, Pakistan and India, very strong religious identities, states with nuclear weapons, and fighting over a territory in Kashmir, make peace a rather elusive idea in that conflict. And I will stop there. There's a lot more I can talk about, but this would require one course or a semester, but I'll be happy to have a discussion and answer any questions. Thank you again.
Thank you, Ayesha.
Right. Okay. So yet another subject that you could do an entire course on, and I will try to give just a high level introduction to, which is the Ethiopian War, which you might have seen in the news this week, because though it started in November of 2020, it's been really under the radar, largely overshadowed by things like the war in Ukraine. But there's been a new offensive by the Ethiopian government, and there is a very real fear of genocide. So a couple of facts that you need to know to understand the Ethiopian War today is that the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, is basically a political party with a military wing that ruled Ethiopia for about 3 decades. And it represents the Tigray people, a distinct ethnic group that are basically about 5% or so of the population of Ethiopia. The population of Ethiopia is about 115 million. So we're talking about a very, very big territory that can cause a lot of issues if it does happen to implode. So the Tigrayan TPLF ran the government and was a fairly abusive and authoritarian regime for a long time, and was back in 2018 pushed out for the government of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who fares from the Oromo ethnic group, which is the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia. And in comes fanfare from everyone saying now Ethiopia is going to be more democratic and liberal and progressive. And as it turns out, that is not what happened. And we often know that it is not the path that we take, but we gave him a Nobel Peace Prize anyway. So we basically blinded ourselves to all of the signs that were coming that no, this new regime was not going to be better than the old regime. But all of this, the signs were coming that this administration was cracking down on civil society, was very particularly targeting who it believed its political enemies to be. And of course, Tigrayans were well within that realm under Prime Minister Abiy's consideration. So there was a lot of tension going back and forth. And I will reiterate, it is not as though the TPLF are really good, positive players. They have a long and difficult history in the country. And so there are reasons that there was a lot of lashback against them. But what we've seen since November 2020, when a political conflict between the TPLF, which is effectively was the regional government of this small, fairly impoverished region in Ethiopia that borders Eritrea, and their political conflict with the government erupted into civil war. You can go into kind of who started it, whose fault this is. But what we have now is a nearly 2-year-old war where both sides have committed atrocities, but by and large, the Ethiopians and their the Ethiopian central government and their Eritrean allies have committed the vast majority of offenses. This is not because the TPLF are, really towing the line of human rights, but it's because of a matter of the blockade that the Ethiopian government has put on Tigray. Where we are now is that there are very real concerns based on what has been said by the Ethiopian officials and by the relationship with Eritrea, which has come in and has really gone gung-ho on going after its mortal enemy, the TPLF. We've got a situation where there is a very real concern that without some form of intervention and some form of peace, there could be an absolute genocide against the Tigrayan people. They have been blockaded for nearly 20 months for most of that period of time. They have had no access to healthcare, to food access, humanitarian care, and banking sources, and internet, and communications, and all sorts of things. And so what you have now is that the best estimates we have, and they're always very difficult, is between 500,000 and 1 million people have already died both through the direct violence and fighting of war, through lack of access to healthcare. People are dying because they don't have insulin, for example, and due to starvation, which is an absolutely horrific way to go. And it seems to be basically a factor of the system, not a bug of the system of the war that the Ethiopian government is fighting. But I'll just say one of the big challenges that we see to reaching peace in this scenario and in many scenarios is that the opposing sides of this conflict have irreconcilable goals. The Ethiopian government wants to ensure that the TPLF and any factors in Tigray can never be a political or military opponent for them again. And they're taking a very hard line on that by wanting to, and have indicated, and it might be hyperbole, but when we're talking about potential genocide, you have to take it seriously. But they've used a lot of language that sounds, kind of very leaning towards the destruction of entire people. There were a couple of reports coming out today by diplomats who would not be named, that they understood that the plan by the Ethiopians, should they be able to take Tigray, would be to round up all the Tigrayan civilians left into camps in order to basically prevent them from playing a role moving forward. So it's a very urgent and dire situation. There are potential peace talks that are in the works, but one of the things that's been really notable is that we have seen signs all along of the move by this government in that direction, that's moving towards more authoritarianism and really incendiary language. But because Ethiopia is a very strong security partner, a partner with the United Nations, a leading player in the peacekeeping mission in Somalia, for example, a big player in peacekeeping missions across Africa, one of the challenges that we have there is that there's been this real tendency to not want to take the Ethiopian government on. And as we know, with any illness, prevention is worth a pound of cure. But in foreign policy, in the realm that I worked in international affairs, we are always going for the immediate urgent instead of the important. And so we often really do neglect prevention. And that is one of the biggest obstacles to a more peaceful world. The US government has invested in atrocities prevention programs and initiatives. But as I saw when I was working in South Sudan, when we do not want to take on a government, or when we do not want to expend the kind of political capital and resources, when we get to a point where peace seems very unlikely, we are really hesitant to invest in what's necessary to do because it feels hopeless. But at the stages when we could have, atrocities prevention efforts and facing on these governments head on was something that I personally saw put on the back burner over and over and over again. And so, I would just say that Ethiopia is one of those warning signs of a place where we saw things developing, not just under this administration, but the US government's support of the TPLF for so many years was another reason why we are not considered credible players for the peace now with the Ethiopian administration in place. And one of the reasons that we kind of built up this, we helped contribute to this deep level of ethnic tension and hatred within Ethiopia. And so, my advice to, the US government, the UN, and other players is that we just have to find a way to invest more at the front end when we see the signs that things are going on. And also just to kind of follow the do no harm rule to make sure that we are not propping up, administrations and strongmen who are then getting built up to a place where we can have the leverage on them that we want, but who we know and can see are following a very predictable path. So I want us to get to an opportunity for more discussion. So that's all I'm going to say on Ethiopia. But I guess the underlying point is that I don't have a lot of strong hope for peace soon there.
Andrea, I think we're really going to depend on you here. Thank you, Lizzie.
Thank you very much. I am trying to respond to your invitation. First, with one very simple, clear answer to the question, is peace possible on our time? Yes, absolutely yes. And it's even more resounding in a way after the three testimonies, presentations that we heard in three very different scenarios, right? Because the emphasis that I would like to make is exactly on the our time, right? So this is a time in which war, as Pope Francis said, is actually present and unfortunately distributed in such a way that you can speak of a third world war in pieces in different areas, and 3 of them we heard. But I think it's also important for us to realize how we have grown collectively as human family in this understanding that peace is not only a power game, it's not only a question of military forces, it's not only a question of military power. And I was intrigued by the switch from Kiev to Kyiv, and how we start adapting to ways in which peace is actually expressed in different forms. So I want to make clear at the beginning of my speech that I'm speaking, one of the reasons I accepted to make this speech is that this is going to be my first speech as an American. I was sworn in yesterday, and I flew to Italy for the first time in my life. I'm 65 now, but after 30 years in the United States, I decided to become an American. And I feel the responsibility of being an American. Feel the responsibility of being an American now, because I think that America has, more than in any other country, the sense of the responsibility of what it means to be a citizen of the world, a responsibility of a peace that is really ours, that is not just for others to be. And partially, this becoming American is connected to the community of Sant'Egidio, this organization that I joined when I was in high school, when we were 25 kids, and now we are 250,000 around the world. And this is important because in all these conflicts that were described before, there are Catholic presence, there are Christian presence, there are Sant'Egidio presence, there are presence of those who try to be peacemakers. And I think that is important for us, especially for those who are participating in the panel, listening, to really reflect on your responsibility as a peacemaker, as a potential peacemaker, as a peacemaker that is today making the effort to understand what it takes, what makes you a potential peacemaker, a possibility of a peacemaker. The reflection that I would like to share is actually connected to this prayer for peace that I'm going to participate in the next few days, that started 36 years ago in Assisi by John Paul II. But before I go into the prayer for peace and how this started, I wanted to remind everybody, all of us, that John Paul II was almost dead. There was an attempted assassination against him on May 13, 1981. And that attempted assassination led him actually in a direction that many people did not expect. That was 5 years later, just 5 years later, to have in Assisi a gathering of all religious leaders to pray for peace, to welcome peace silently. Even the way in which the gathering was organized was particularly important, because every religious tradition is invited to pray in its own way, Hindu as a Hindu, Muslim as a Muslim, Christian as Christians, and Jew as Jews, and so on and so forth. And then come together in the square silently, welcoming each other peacefully in the presence of each other, welcoming the peace that comes to us when we welcome each other peacefully. In the silence, the peace is received. Is in the silence that is stronger than the power of those who use the weapons that peace is received. And the point that I want to make is it's interesting, right, that when somebody shoots you and almost kills you, the answer is actually going in the direction of seeking peace and looking for peace. We were reminded of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think it's important to remember that much of that collapse were actually expression also of forces that were coming within the Soviet Union that didn't require invasions and power of the sword that weapons can provide. So I think it's important for us to see how the community of Sant'Egidio became the holder of this hope that actually it is possible for all of us to work for peace. And 30 years ago, exactly 30 years ago, we were able to conclude the first major negotiation project for Sant'Egidio, 2.5 years of work in Mozambique. 30 years ago, Mozambique signed this first general peace agreement. And I think it's important for us to remember that all this is possible because there is a very intense tradition of diplomacy within the Catholic Church that goes back for centuries. So I was really intrigued by the references to strong diplomacy and robust diplomacy. Hopefully in the discussion we will get there. But I'm personally, as an American, really appalled by the fact that there is no American ambassador in Moscow today. And that the channels of communications were much, much stronger when Kennedy and Khrushchev were in a way discussing, right? And yet we are so close and so capable of speaking and so able of doing things, but relationships do count. It is important for somebody to be diplomatically attuned with the country. It takes time to know people. It takes time to know the situation. It's not possible to simply invent peace out of nothing. And I think it's important for those of us who are Catholic. I know that the college itself is Catholic, certainly Sant'Egidio is Catholic, but there is this very intense rediscovery of the role of the Catholic Church in the service of peace and in the service of this humanity longing for peace. The Church clearly, through the Holy See, has a long tradition of diplomatic work. That's where Sant'Egidio learn how to do diplomatic work. But I think it's important to move from a Catholic peacemaking to actually a humanity peacemaking, really to make this leap that Assisi makes clear, that peace doesn't come out of nothing. It comes out of words that are chosen freely, exchanged freely in the presence of each other. And those words can be found only when presence is accepted. So in many ways, we can say that peace comes in trusting more the uncertainty of each other's freedom than the false certainty of war and violence. I repeat, peace comes in trusting more the uncertainty of each other's freedom than the false certainty of war and violence. And in this sense, I would like to conclude with John the 23rd invitation that was so repeated during Vatican II and that led to John Paul II, that led to Paul VI, that led to many things that we see. Seek what unites and not what divides. These words were put into the first joint communique in Mozambique, are now part of the Mozambique Constitution. And I think that this is actually something that should really make all of us reflect. Can we seek what unites? Look at the United States. Look at the politics in the United States. Look at the rhetoric in the United States. Is seeking what unites possible? So yes, peace is possible if it is ours. Yes, peace is possible if all of us, each of us, take the responsibility of peacemaking seriously. And peace is possible if we are really seeking it and pursuing it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you. What we're hoping is that you'll engage one another before we turn to Q&A. So I think you can unmute yourselves and go from there, right?
I'd love to start by saying that I think that Andrea's points are really, as somebody who worked on the front lines in a place where, we struggled to figure out where you could find some entity that is trusted by both sides. In South Sudan, it was the church. I actually distinctly recall these conversations. We were at a complete loss. We were talking to the president of the country, talking to the kind of leaders of the opposition. And I just remember this moment where someone was like, can we get the Pope to call? But I say that as it is this individual thing on the ground, but trust is this incredibly important thing. I'm skeptical, as you might understand, of peace everywhere all at the same time that is sustainable. But that's because it's not the way that we go about that the US government and that other entities in kind of governmental roles goes about it. They typically start with an immediate effort to haggle something between the two fighting forces and the ones with guns. And that might get you a ceasefire, but it will not bring you peace. What will bring you peace is the trust building and an inclusive effort to bring people along so that you can, find the way to navigate by knowing who the players are, by knowing the cultures, and by knowing who they trust and where you can find mutual trust in order to navigate and find ways to make concessions and build steps towards a more inclusive outcome. Now, in things like the US government, the focus is often on what's the quickest, fastest, dirtiest way that we can get this done. And then the second that we get a peace agreement, and the US does have a tremendous role to play because it has a lot of influence, and not just because it's the right thing to do, but because a more peaceful, prosperous world is in our US national security interest. It is not simply altruistic, but far too often, because of the urgencies that abound everywhere else, once we get a peace agreement, we kind of walk away and we're like, good job, we're done. And when you do that, you miss that opportunity to the hard, long-term generational work to ensure that you build sustainable peace. So I do think that those players that can build trust, who are outside the fighting parties and outside the governments, we really don't utilize nearly as much as we should.
Ayesha, did you want to speak, please?
Yes. So I wish I could share Andrea's optimism about peace, and I would really like to. At a fundamental level, I think we are all driven to being humanists, right? Whether it's a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu. But I'm sort of looking at it again from the perspective of states in the international system and the role of institutions that are supposed to bring about peace. Let's talk about the UN, right? The United Nations. Today, the UN Security Council contains some of the most serious violators of peace. I mean, the members of the UN Security Council are some of the worst aggressors in the world, right? This includes, unfortunately, the United States in the past through its wars in Iraq. And currently, we see Russia and under Putin using nuclear blackmail. We saw the UN do nothing in Afghanistan when the Taliban took over, even though we often see its reports. Now, I'm not trying to deride the UN, but this is a question. I mean, the UN does a lot of good work, but the question is the Security Council seems dysfunctional. And if there are aggressor states who commit the worst violations, deciding questions of war and peace, then perhaps that's one avenue that needs to be investigated more. Just the second thing that I think is sort of interesting from this discussion is that the perceptions of the West in the developing world, right, are different from the perceptions of people in the West about what the West does, right? And again, I think that's useful from the perspective of state interests or interests of whether it's American foreign policy or Russian foreign policy or what have you. But for instance, in the India-Pakistan case, right, India is often doesn't really trust the West when sort of it sells F-16s to Pakistan because it thinks, oh, well, our territorial integrity is being undermined. Now, I'm saying India has made some terrible mistakes in this current conflict by abstaining in the war, right? And that's a separate discussion, which I've talked about in other places. But I think we need to look at what are the institutions in the world, right, that are supposed to bring about peace. And here the UN comes to mind, right? And why are they failing so miserably? So.
Andrea, please.
Thank you. I definitely don't think that peace can come everywhere all the time. It can be sustainable if it is not real in the interactions that are constructed over time seriously. So in that sense, I think that what I'm trying to introduce is actually that peace is much more realist than many people think, and that war, especially in a nuclear age, is exceedingly paradoxical and dangerous. Is really outside the realm of rationality, way beyond that. And I think that what is needed is not only looking at institutions, but rather leadership that can be distributed through people like you, like me, like everybody, that takes peace seriously. So I wanted to enrich Beth's presentation on the Kiev before, also reminding everybody that after the revolution in Maidan Square, there was a hope for the world, and that in a funny way, Sant'Egidio happened to be in a church where Protestant, and let's not forget that Christians are also killed Christians for a long time, right? And for quite some time, it's not that that those divisions are not relevant. But in Maidan Square, there were Orthodox praying, Greek Orthodox praying, Catholic praying, Protestant praying, and so on. That's not possible at the moment because of the violence, but the long-term rational things to do is to really believe in peace and work for it.
So, well, you know, that's such a hopeful, right, argument to make. I can't help but think when you say we need, you know, leadership that, that really hopes and yearns for and reaches for peace. I can't help but think about the irrational leadership that we have, and, you know, tucked away in all of these conflicts, not really tucked away, but somehow maybe somewhat overlooked. North Korea's recent, ballistic missile launches, right, over Japan, which probably more than any conflict, if it's not conflict, it's really a something slightly different, but more than any other conflict, it makes you wonder, right, about the irrationality, right, of leadership, how do you respond to that? I think there are good questions to be raised about Putin and his sort of frame of mind and his, I don't know, was there a change in Putin's, in his character and his personality and his leadership, something, fundamental that has created something less than rational at this point that we're dealing with. So what do we do, right? If we're searching for peace, and we need to find it in leaders who are willing to embrace, right, these concepts, what do we do in the face of irrationality?
Bernard, do you mind if I make a comment at this point? Given that one of the fundamental principles of neoclassical economics is rational behavior, I've been thinking about two things. One, the economic foundation to many of these conflicts. So if anyone would like to speak to that, I think in particular about land. Many of these disputes are about land. Yes, they're, sort of, one could argue maybe they're cast in terms of culture and other aspects, but and political power, but really isn't that fundamentally to get access to resources? And then the other part that I wouldn't mind hearing from others about would be rationality in terms of peace, right? That it is more rational to have a peaceful environment because one can be happier, one can have access to resources. One of the first things I thought about when I saw the destruction after the initial Russian invasion in Ukraine was, what a waste of resources. Not just the beauty and tradition in many of those structures, but just the waste. And I mean, hopefully they will be rebuilt at some point. So I'll just leave it at that if anyone would like to comment on the economic aspects of some of these conflicts and maybe the hope for rational or motivation from the populace because of the rationality that they might experience.
I'd be happy to chime in on this. I don't have a lot to say on the specific economics, but war is often fought over access to resources, but and I think that we've seen this with Russia. I mean, Ukraine for a very long time, Germany looked to it as a place for resources. Back in World War II, before World War I, World War II, Russia has certainly looked at it as a place for access to resources, access to a port, to a warm water deep port in the Black Sea, access to things that it didn't have. And all of those access to resources feed into kind of that original, at least pseudo-rational decision, because the decision to go to war is always made after a cost-benefit analysis. I don't believe that Putin, when he decided to do this, was irrational. I do think that the longer that a leader, an authoritarian leader, is in power, they get less good information around them with which to make those decisions. They start to close the circle. They start to push people out that they don't trust. The circle of people that they trust to give them information is smaller and smaller. So he made his decision based on bad information. But for him, it was a rational decision because he thought that the US, that Europe were not going to come to Ukraine's aid in the way that it did, because he thought that the Zelensky government was going to leave, because he thought that his military was much stronger than it is, which is a very common thing with authoritarian powers that are kind of built on a bit of a house of cards. So I think when the war began, he had his own form of rationality, but it was based on bad facts. And then when you continue through this, where he is now, if he loses this war and has nothing to show for it at home, he is deeply weakened. So is it irrational for him to keep fighting this war? Personally, it's probably rational for him to keep fighting this war because he's got nothing after it. If he goes home, got tail between his legs without being able to at least make a case that he's done well, then he is going to have, basically bet the house on something that lost really big. So I don't see a scenario where he really wants to come out, but that's where you look into that strong diplomacy and that effort that is needed, not because we can work with Putin to make peace right now over Ukraine, not because Zelensky can work with Putin to make peace, but because if you keep the doors open, if you continue things like prisoner exchanges, which build small bits of trust between the different sides, they open up more opportunities for diplomacy between people who may be under Putin at different levels, and they create the groundwork for where at some stage, and you do this with kind of track 2 diplomacy as well, which track 2 diplomacy being diplomacy by people who are not parts and representatives of the government officially, but who open those lines of communication. And you do that in order to create that space so that when something changes that you can't make happen, but when that changes, there is an opportunity for peace and hopefully an opportunity for a more sustainable one. We can't force it to happen, but we can create the conditions so that if something changes, you got a path of peace there, and it's not just inevitable fighting, but it's really hard. And there are going to be questions. If you're looking at Russia and you've invested this much, you got to get some of those resources that you fought for. If you're looking at this from Putin's perspective.
Can I
follow up? Please. Who's
Bernard,
that?
can I just for a minute, just respond to Andrea? Yeah. Not Andrea, sorry, Lizzie. Lizzie, so I, think I differ a little bit about Putin being rational. Yeah, he is rational, but engaging in facts. Actually, he's engaging systematically in disinformation, and he's doing that intentionally, right? And I think that's a type of warfare, this disinformation warfare that weakens Ukraine. So I think, a lot of that has got to do with maintaining sort of Russia's imperial ambitions, maintaining its sort of identity in Crimea and other parts that are that they believe are theirs. And so, because they've been doing this with India as well, because India and Russia sort of have a strong defense relationship, but they've been pushing the disinformation into the Indian media, and which is why I wanted to kind of just bring that up. So
those two are absolutely happening at the same time. I think he gets bad intel, but absolutely one of their most effective forms of warfare is disinformation.
And if I can just quickly weigh in, you're right. If we assume rationality to be something like, maximizing his self-interest on every decision for every calculus he makes, then sure, we might call him rational. But what is his self-interest here? If we speak of it just in economic terms, we're missing something. If we speak of it, I think just in political terms, we're missing something. If we look at his belief, right, in this idea that Ukrainian and Belarusian identity is not real. It's a construction, right, of probably of fascists in the West, and really that's Russia, right? Belongs to Russia. Those are Russians. Then we've stretched, right, the concept of rationality to a point where it's hard to know how to pursue peace if he has that kind of calculus in mind. It's hard to know exactly what would move him, right, to accept, right, an end to the invasion. So I guess it depends on how we construct or how we define rationality. But I think we really have to stretch the term quite a bit beyond sort of its original economic basis or its original sort of economic source in order to really understand Putin.
We have an interesting question from the chat that I want to put to all of you. Lizzie, I had a follow-up too that I thought might connect some of what you were saying to some of Andrea's comments, but from the chat. So Professor Admiraal spoke of the Russian Orthodox Church. Each speaker, it seems, has suggested that conservative religious actors sometimes might be understood as behind the various conflicts that you've discussed. Is that an accurate understanding? Whether it's accurate or not, what responsibility do the various religious traditions have as institutions for clearing away obstacles to sustainable peace? So you have to unmute to answer. Here we go. Please, I'm sorry, Andrea.
On the Catholic side, I would say that the Catholic Church has been moving away from war for a century and a half, at least. From Leo XIII, all popes have been very consistent on peace. And this was partially because the wars that were coming to Europe, World War I, World War II, were also among Christian Catholic countries, and but also because of the futility of war. There is a obviously significant imagination also with the apparition of Fatima and these three children invited to fast and pray against this massive slaughtering of industrial proportion that got Europe through, right? So the Catholic Church is definitely not the Catholic Church of the Crusades anymore. It is a church that, especially after Vatican II and after Pacem in Terris of John the 23rd, really embraced peace as a vocation, as a responsibility. I was insisting on John Paul II personally, because he came out of a Poland that was under Soviet occupation. He came under a regime that was, quote unquote, rational in its use of its violence. And the response was actually very creative from the Catholic side. So I would say that what I see from the Catholic side is that definitely the religion itself institutionally is way far not in the direction of war, but actually consistently, diplomatically, politically engaged in terms of peace. But what I find important is that there was this significant shift in the direction of other religions, which for the Catholic Church is certainly very new. So the prayer for peace in Assisi in 86 is a significant leap. And in that sense, what we see in Burkina Faso, for example, where the two warring factions are fighting each other, they're going into a civil war, and the religious leaders come together and they're able to negotiate so much that one leaves, the other stays, the power is shared in such a way that there is no escalation and violence in the proportion that could have been if the country was really split in two. I find it very interesting, because I find it exactly that humans through religious groups are able to organize options for peacemaking that were not previously available to us.
I would
Oh, Ayesha, please.
Go ahead.
I want to hear from Beth too, since she began with
Yeah,
the
and Beth, go ahead,
conflict
and then
within
I'll add.
Orthodoxy. No. Ayesha, you first.
Very quickly, just to add a bit of glimmer of hope to the peace aspect and sort of endorse Andrea's point of view, that yes, I think there are people in every religion who are secular. You know, as a secular Hindu, I believe I'm a secular Hindu. I do push back, and there are many like me who have pushed back against what we believe is dangerous sort of majoritarian Hindu nationalism or religious extremism. And so I think there are similar people even within Islam who push back against hardcore Islamist hardliners. And I think secular humanism is perhaps the way to think about peace.
Yeah, and I'll say in response that, you know, while I started with the Orthodox Church and sort of opened the door for thinking about this conflict through a religious lens, I don't think that's the only lens, maybe the most important one even. It just is one that is less talked about, less in the news. And so I thought it might be a helpful addition to the other aspects of the war, for sure. So I think that, you know, I don't want to overstate, right? You know, the way in which the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church has, you know, aided Putin in his endeavors. You know, he's an aid, he's a help, he's fostering, right, the war in many cases. But for Putin, he's just one of many tools in his toolbox, and and religion is just one motivator of, I think, many motivators. So I think we would be heading down the wrong direction to say these are just religious conflicts and full stop there, even if there's a religious element to all of them.
Let me quickly ask that follow-up question I wanted to ask of Lizzie. I think you were talking about what I believe you've termed, I'll call it transitional peace talks. So especially when you have conflicts where two sides have, as you put it, irreconcilable goals, thinking about Ethiopia, it could be quite difficult to know how you even begin to get the two sides talking, and could be quite difficult to know how to begin to get Ukraine and Putin talking. But you suggested, well, no, there are ways, but you need to reorient your hopes, let's say, have different goals for those talks. I wonder if you could say just a little bit more about that, and that might connect, Andrea, to the work of Sant'Egidio. Might be interesting to see if we can find some points of connection there.
Certainly. Well, I'll say there are kind of two things to talk about there. There's transitional justice, which typically is what's happening kind of after the conflict, but what is put in place in order to transition from conflict to ensure that you don't go right back to conflict. And for me, the real critical piece there is being a lot more inclusive with who you include at the table and in the negotiations over how you take step by step to move forward as a community, as a country, as a nation. But that's a little bit different from kind of looking into the kind of intermediary steps of peace talks. You might not at this stage, with irreconcilable differences between, you know, the two sides in Ethiopia, between the two sides in the war in Ukraine. Ukraine is it's easy for all of us to look at Ukraine and say there's a good side, there's a right and a wrong and a good side, a bad side, but you still have to negotiate something. Even after the United States government dropped nuclear bombs in Japan, the conclusion was not just a flat surrender, it was negotiated terms that happened. So there will have to be peace talks at the end of any conflict, regardless of what's happening. But in the meantime, before you get to the point where it's kind of clear who's got the upper hand, enough so to reach an end, there are ways that you can build trust. And you build trust by, in any negotiation, the best thing to do is to look at who's across the table and figure out what is valuable to them. And think about what's valuable to you and kind of almost just list it out. And right now, what we're seeing in scenarios in Ukraine and Russia, for example, is, you know, as I said, with prisoner swaps. Prisoner swaps are a fairly simple thing, but Russia has people they really want to get back who have been taken as, as POWs, prisoners of war. Ukraine has the same. If you shut the door down to any discussion, which some people and some commentators are saying it's absolute blasphemy to speak with Putin and his government because he is the bad guy here, then you do not have a path forward for any kind of conversation. And as I mentioned, it's not that, based on the conditions in the war right now, You could talk all day long with Putin and not get to a conclusion with this war. Other factors are going to have to change. Factors on the battlefield, factors in the economy, factors in the domestic scenario in Russia. But if you find ways along the way to keep that door open, to continue talking, to continue building relationships at different levels, to keep that diplomatic door open, whether it's between Ukraine and Russia, the US and Russia, China and Russia and the US talking to China, if we can find ways to navigate other people who matter. Turkey, which has been able to work with the UN to talk to Russia about grain exports, for example. That's another place where you're able to do some trust building or realize that you can't. But those are the types of steps along the way. If you can't fix the big picture immediately, you still have an obligation, if you have an interest in the outcome being peaceful, and finding other ways to build bits of trust and make little baby steps forward. You just never know when something's going to change in the domestic situation in a country that you have nothing to do with, that might make those steps worthwhile.
I wanted to observe, responding on Ayesha's point on secularism, that to my knowledge, Mr. Gandhi was not secular in a way a secular person today would recognize, right? He was very spiritual, he was clearly a believer, he was clearly a dedicated person. I think that the distinction secular spiritual, I think it's an interesting one. And what Sant'Egidio does most of the time, and it's interesting, this Elizabeth insistence on the negotiating table, offering listening to the others, right? You know, what is valuable for the others. But there is a in many countries a realization that if I look at Ethiopia, for example, is very clear that even just thinking about peace, even just speaking about peace is dangerous. It's dangerous for those who are speaking about peace. It's dangerous for those who are receiving the message and so on. So Sant'Egidio does what the Vatican has done for thousands of years, that is listening, providing a space that is safe and confidential, where people that cannot say what they cannot say in public can say it privately. So the advantage of that approach is that obviously we gain intelligence, because we gain intelligence on what is the reasoning behind and what are the difficulties and the bias and the complications of organizing even the possibility of these conversations. I think that way too often the emphasis is on content, what is the bargaining issue, and not enough on the political capacity to create the constituencies for peace that will justify the move, that will recreate the state in such a way that is different. So the reason of my insisting on diplomacy is because many things must be said silently, confidentially, in closed door first. Very rarely you can do peace in the open, on the street, shouting. So.
Okay, I think this may be our last question. And it's open to everyone. I hope everyone on the panel will take a moment to respond. And it really comes down to what is your hope for peace? And maybe, you know, we've touched a bit on what peace is, but if you want to speak more specifically about your conception of peace, and just tell us what your hope for peace is. Thanks.
I guess since I started last time, I'll start again, and I'll speak very quickly. You know, I think we have to shy away from speaking of peace as simply the absence of conflict, and think more about ways in which we can have peace building and peace creating that involves not just I'll stand my side, you stand your side, but you know. Yeah, like others have said, right? Communication lines, bringing together, different religious groups across borders. Trade is a pretty important piece, right? If you trade, right, that makes you less likely to return to war. So I think peace has to look in Russia, Ukraine as something more than just the Russian tanks rolling out and going back home.
And share my thoughts, which are, my hope for peace is that we're in this increasingly globalized world, and I think that it's become much more obvious that stability and prosperity in other parts of the world has a direct impact on us here at home and on other people around the world, and on leadership in the EU, for example. It has an impact in places like China. And so if all of the countries around the world get a greater recognition of what we gain from more peace in other places, and particularly the ones who have created a lot of conflict in the past, like the United States, my hope is that we will invest more at the front end in avoiding the unintended consequences that can create conflict in other places, and recognize more that it is not, creating peace elsewhere is not about altruism. It's about our own national and economic security and benefits. And that kind of drive, the way that we're all tied together more, will put those folks who are in positions of power and authority to invest more in prevention mechanisms and peace on the front end, rather than just responding to the fires on the back end.
Quickly, my hope for peace is in the ordinary man, the ordinary individual, many of whom are invisible activists who speak out against repression, who speak out against authoritarianism, global fascism. That's where my hope is. These are the people who can probably bring about change, and also people who are aware of the type of information that they consume, because I think a lot of conflict in the world comes from information that is not based on evidence, right? It's disinformation. So knowing what we consume, the responsibility rests with ordinary men and women.
I agree with Ayesha. I share that hope that ordinary people will take their own responsibility and capacity seriously. I think that the world needs more people engagement on the side of peace, seriously engaging where the engagement is needed. So, and I hope that the religious organization will be at the service of this. They will be encouraging this. They will be encouraging this rather than the opposite choice of, fueling extremism and trying to dominate the world through a violent project that has no future whatsoever.
Thank you, Margarita, for your question. Thank you for co-moderating with me, and special thanks to our presenters. That was really an excellent and really interesting conversation. Thanks to everybody too who joined us and stayed with us to the very end. We're finished. Have a good night. I should say that Andrea is joining us from Rome, where it's about 2:15 a.m.
2:15 a.m. Exactly. So sometimes I'm a little not completely
That's my
present,
hope for
but
peace.
it was
Is
very,
that
very engaging.
he's
Very
up
nice.
late fighting for peace.
It's good to fight, right? It's
Congratulations on becoming a citizen as well. I will send information about the prayer for peace that Andrea mentioned to everybody, to all the registrants for this event. So if you want, you can learn some more about that. All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.